morning, my name is Adrian Rhodes. I am currently exhibiting at Francis Marion's University Place Gallery. I had hoped to come visit you all on campus and give some lectures and discussions about my work, but unfortunately, with the situation right now, this is going to be video. So I'm going to talk a little bit about myself and my work. I do encourage you all, if you have any more questions, to reach out to me. You can find me through Instagram at Adrian_Rhodes. It's ADRIAN_Rhodes. Or through my website, it has a contact form, which is www.adrianrhodes.com. I'd be more than happy to talk with anybody further at any length. I'm hoping that you'll get the chance to go see the show downtown once everything opens back up again. It should still be up. So there's some pretty, I think, exciting things happening there. I hope you get the chance to go and check it out. So I live in Hartsville, South Carolina. I've always lived in Hartsville. I was born in Hartsville. I live in Hartsville. Someday I will die in Hartsville because I love my hometown. There's a lot of really, I think, nice things about living in a small city. So I've always lived in this small town, but I've always been really interested in art. So I'm looking at this first topic to talk about how I became interested in art. I kind of feel like that's asking, how does a person become interested in breathing? It's really a way of just seeing the world, processing the world, thinking about the world, moving through the world, and it is something that has always been a huge part of me. Now that said, I never had any serious or formal art education coming through K through 12. I had a couple of classes in, that's not entirely true. I had a really great elementary school teacher, art teacher, up through 6th grade, and she was really encouraging and wonderful. But then I didn't really have art again until I was a senior in high school, and I went to the art teacher with a really bad sketchbook of really bad drawings, and I showed it to her and I said, I'm gonna be an artist, please. I can never get in because the classes are full. Can you help me out? And I think it was just the moxie that impressed her because the drawings were really, really, really crappy. Looking back at them now, I think they were really terrible. But I think it was the pluck that impressed her, and she passed me out of the first level of drawing and on up so that I could get some experience. But I still didn't have very much art education, and I really went into college feeling like I was completely fresh and had no background, no underlying training going into it. So I was always a little bit nervous going in. And then I went to Winthrop University, BFA. I couldn't make my mind up. Everything looked so amazing. So I did a general studio, which let me pick 2 concentrations, and I did drawing and painting. I didn't find out about printmaking until the latter half of my sophomore year, at which point I'd already pretty committed to the drawing. If I had discovered printmaking just a little bit earlier, I think I would have been a printmaking and painting major instead of a drawing and painting major. But it turns out printmaking is really just another discipline of drawing anyway. It's like drawing but harder. So they're very closely entwined and related. And I've just always been the type to, once you dive in harder. Once you can go more. And I think that shows in the kind of work I do. I'm really a maximalist, and I love to make and push and grow and explore. So as soon as I got started with my education seriously in art, I've been working 60 or 80 hours a week for the last, 20 years, making, reading, doing, teaching, studying, full-time art round the clock. So it's something that I've always breathed in and out of myself, and that has brought me to where I am today. All right, so what is the MFA, and what do you do in terms of class and independent work? The MFA, or the Master of Fine Arts, is the terminal degree in your studio art field. That means that it is the highest academic degree in the studio arts discipline. There's a couple others. You can get an MFA in creative writing, you can get an MFA in theater, but within the branches of creative thought that offer an MFA in academia, it's the terminal degree. It's the end of the line. It's the top of the road. That means that if you have the MFA, as far as the university is concerned, you're on par with a doctor or a doctorate. for terms of academic promotion, advancement, and employment. I'm an adjunct, and even as an adjunct at my institution, adjuncts are paid on a sliding rate, sometimes, like for a summer class, not during the year, but for a summer class, it's a sliding rate based on your credentials. So, like if you have a master's degree, you get a certain tier level, and if you have a doctorate, you get a higher level of compensation. Well, the MFA, as the terminal degree in the field, is considered to be on par with the doctorate, not with a master's. One of the reasons for this is because it's a much more intense degree. So a lot of master's degrees are 30 credit hours that you can complete in 2 years, or if you studied like really loaded schedules, maybe even like a year and a half. But it's typically a 2-year program with a written thesis that is guided to prepare you to go on to a doctorate program, whereas a MFA is a 3-year, 60-hour program, so it's twice as long, and your thesis is a much bigger deal. So it's a written component and an exhibition component, along with your spoken defense, and it's really geared at training you to go into academia, but that's not the best reason to go get an MFA. The best reason to go get an MFA is it's like an Instapot for your studio practice. You have a confined amount of time and a whole lot of pressure, and so it makes the stuff that's inside cook faster. And I use a lot of food analogies when I'm talking about art and art making, but that's what it is. The MFA is an instant pot for your art practice, and it is going to cook you faster, and it's going to develop you faster, so that when you come out the other end, you have a surer footing of the kind of art you want to make, why you want to make it, what you're doing. It is really, really intense. It is mostly self-directed. You do have professors who guide you, but they guide you in that Socratic question-asking kind of way and push you forward in your art practice. So when I went into my MFA, although I am an academic and I do teach, and I love it, my students are fantastic, but I didn't go into getting an MFA because I wanted a tenure track position. I went into getting an MFA because I wanted to develop my artwork and I wanted to push myself. It's a really quick way to kick yourself like 8 years down the road. So I feel like I would be making the same work now, but like a decade later in my life, if I hadn't gone to the MFA, if that makes any sense. So that's what I think the MFA is. It's that real pressure cooker for your artistic practice. So the classes are self-directed. You study along your own interests, you explore your own concepts, and you really have to play defense a lot because people are going to ask you questions. And in the asking questions, it really makes you start to think about why you're doing, how you're doing, what you're doing. So it's really exciting. I loved it. If I could have stayed in my second year MFA for forever, I would have. My exhibition at University Place Gallery is a immersive print-based installation. I'm kind of an oddball. Printmakers are thought of as a flat medium more often than not. It's on paper. So printmaking, it encompasses woodcuts, relief, linoleum relief, etchings, lithographs, screen prints. All of these are work on paper, and people have this really set idea of what work on paper means, and it means something like this back behind me. Pretty flat, on paper, framed, and presented in a manageable size and scale and scope. And you can have beautiful prints that follow those parameters. But I take it into a different ballpark. And so the thing that sets printmaking apart from other art mediums is that you have it in multiple. So if I was a painter, I would spend all of my time making a painting, and then when I was done, I would have one painting. And as a printmaker, I spend all of my time creating a matrix, and the matrix is my wood carving, or it is the drawing on the lithostone, or it is that metal plate holding my etching. And after I spent the time making the matrix, I can then pull multiple images off of that matrix. And so instead of having one painting, I can have an almost infinite number of prints off of that carving. Each print is considered to be a unique, original piece of artwork. These are not copies and they are not reproductions, but it is a way of making many, something that exists in multitude, which might be even more interesting after this current situation dies down, right? Multitudes, many, many, many crowds, right? I miss crowds. So, my exhibition, I started thinking a few years ago, what is it that we can do with printmaking that we can't do with painting or drawing straight up? What is it that sets it apart? It's the multiple. So what can I do with the multiple? What can I do with something that exists in many, many not copies, but reproductions, not reproductions. I get a whole stack of them, right? So instead of taking each one and framing it, because I have so many of them, what can I do with it that's different? And I went with installation. So what I do is I think of the individual print as a module, as a component, and I design my prints so that I can build them on top of each other and create these really immersive, encompassing, overwhelming experiences as you walk into them. But I haven't completely given up the individual artwork either, so I exist in this kind of weird hybrid in-between space. I still make paintings, I still make individual artworks, but then I situate them within the context of this installation, and so it's like little conversations, little snippets of thoughts inside this greater interlocking whole as I examine different themes and ideas and thoughts and processes. And so when you go into the gallery at University Place right now, you can see almost these little vignettes, and then a little bit from this one is taken and put over that one, and a little bit from that one is taken and moved over here with this one, and then a little bit of this one's brought back to the first one. And so these all move around and they commingle and they feed off of each other, and they build and they grow into this like symphony of visual influences that move throughout the space. And my hope is that somebody can go into that space and they'll see, oh, I recognize this from over here. What is that connection between what I'm seeing in these two different pieces? And then I recognize how this is taken and pulled over here. So what's this connection here? And as you move around, you can see all these different parts complementing each other and building off of each other and growing on top of each other. So when I work, I don't work on one piece at a time. I work on several pieces at a time, so they cross-influence each other, and it gets really complex sometimes. But another thing about my artwork is that I'm a really big believer in personal iconography. Now, you may have studied about iconography in your art history classes. And iconography is just this idea that images have meaning. It's the symbolism behind your meanings. And I think like the most obvious one people talk about is the vanitas, which was this genre of Dutch still life where the skull represents death and the candle with the flame blown out represents the brief passage of time, and the flowers represent youth, and then their wilt represents decay. And so it's this whole idea about time passing and mortality, and how each item in the still life, the clock represents the inevitable passage of time, and the stack of books represents the knowledge of the world and how you can't take it with you. It's kind of dark, but it's like a really obvious example of iconography. Another one is like the language of flowers. So the yellow rose means friendship, while the red rose is romance. And so this idea of the symbolism behind your imagery. So when I say personal iconography, I mean the images that I choose to work with over and over within my work, and the meaning that they have to me, and the meaning that they have in a broader context, and how when I layer these different types of imagery, what I can do is communicate through kind of a visual metaphor. So the number one off the bat everybody always asks me about is the bees, because you walk into my room and it's like this swarm of bees inside a hive crawling, literally crawling over the walls. And for me, bees represent maternal bonds, the hierarchy of the matriline. So my work all comes from a very personal place. I think that as an artist, all that you can do is talk about your own lived experience. So my mother died before my children were born. I have 2 daughters, and there's this set up from that basic situation in my life. It sets up this very interesting line of the maternal relationships. So I look at my children and I look at my daughters, and I can see the influence of my mother in them, even though they never met. And so I also find myself at this crossroads where I was a daughter and now I'm a mother of daughters, but I never had a moment where these 2 roles were simultaneous. It was one and then the other. And so it really leads the matriline to be a very prominent obsession within my work. And I find bees to be a really great way to examine this for a lot of different reasons. First of all, bees are matriarchal societies. And they go, the queen, and then the worker bees are all her daughters or nieces. They're all either their sisters. All the worker bees are sisters. And then the process of swarming and the way the hive splits and reproduces, and then the new queen, the daughter queen in the hive. So I won't go into a whole lecture about bees and beehives right now, but they're fascinating. And so the way that the beehive is structured socially, to me, is a very strong metaphor for a matriline. Beehives are fragile, but they're also rather resilient. So there's a duality there. And they are vitally important as pollinators. So the vitality, fragility, resilience, and matriarchal structure of bee society, to me, is just a direct analogous comparison to a matriline. Mothers, daughters, sisters, nieces. Here comes my daughter running through upset about something. Right on cue. So there we go with that. I could hear her in the background. Some other images that I use in my artwork are sky charts. I use them as a way to talk about different aspects of the human experience. So when you look at a sky chart or a sky map, you can see the constellations. I'm sorry, I just completely lost my train of thought. Let's get back to it. All right, so when you look at a sky chart, what you're looking at is every point in the heavens is lined up. Every star is cataloged, counted, and put in its place. And to me, that speaks of control. It's this idea that if you can take every aspect of the universe and you know where it is, what it's doing, how it's moving, then you can predict how it's going to move and where it's going to be in the future. So it's this effort to control something that is in all actuality completely beyond the scope of your control. It's like human pride trying to number the stars and catalog them. And if I know where they are, then I will know that I can make my plans and they're going to come through, and this craziness in the world isn't going to come in and disrupt what I have thought out and what I want to do. I can keep myself and my things and my people safe. Of course, that's ludicrous. You can't do that. The other thing that I like about sky charts is that the constellations come from Greek mythology. And Greek mythology was the first mythology where man created God in his own image. If you think about like the Egyptians, you have these animal human hybrids, these like very distant, powerful beings. But in Greek mythology, they're very human. They look human. They act human. Their stories are very human. Zeus is this all-powerful god of the gods, the king of the gods. But 98% of Greek mythology's problems come from Zeus misbehaving and his wife getting pissed off about it. So it is a very human story, and it is a moment of humanity's triumphs and folly all rolled up into one, and that's why I love Greek mythology so much. And so when I pull in an image from Greek mythology and throw it into the mix, I can pull whatever connotations come from that myth and throw it into the mix. And it's just a way of adding this beautiful humanity into it. And if you look at the constellations, the story of them was of preservation. So the gods would see something transpire. Like if you look at the Gemini, Castor and Pollux, there were these twins, and one of them was mortal and one of them was immortal. And so when one of them died, their bond was so strong, when the mortal one died, their bond was so strong that the gods were like, no, we can't separate them even now. So instead of them dying, they like shared in immortality and were placed into the heavens as the constellation Gemini and the stars Castor and Pollux. And so this idea that you can preserve things and set them in the stars to last forever kind of goes back to that first feeling about the sky charts, and that's why I love to use the sky charts so much. I use polyhedra because of the perfection of the geometry. It goes back to these ideas of control and order and structure that is then broken apart within my work. I use the observatory as a stand-in for myself. Really, it's a stand-in for the artist studio. So if you think about it, the observatory is where someone goes up on top of a mountain in solitude and practices this great extra, looking out and studying. And I feel like the art studio is very similar, where the artist goes into the studio and practices this deep introspection of looking and thinking and philosophizing and delving, and produces something from that experience. So the observatory is a real analogy for me and the art studio. And then the pomegranate I have to come back to, and so I could talk about pomegranates for a really long time because they are fascinating and complex images. And the obvious is the story of Persephone, going back to the Greek mythology. And so through the story of Persephone, where she was kidnapped by Hades and taken down in the underworld, and he wanted to make her his queen. But her mother, the goddess of the earth and the harvest, was so distraught that Zeus said, okay, nothing on the earth is growing because Demeter is so distraught at her daughter dying. Let's bring her back. When Persephone heard this, she was overjoyed, and she hadn't eaten or drinking anything while she was in the underworld. But when she found out she got to go home, she was so happy, she ate 3 seeds of the pomegranate. And when the gods learned that she had eaten the food from the land of the dead, they realized that she would have to go back. And so they struck a compromise where for 3 months of the year she would go to the underworld, and that was the Greek explanation for the seasons. The cycle of Persephone being reborn in spring, and then through the summer, fall, she would prepare for her journey back to the underworld, and then in the winter when nothing grew is when she was serving as the queen of the dead. So the pomegranate has those associations with Persephone and Demeter and their story, and goes back to the matriline again, and it goes to loss, and it goes to death. But when you look at the pomegranate, when you split it open, it has this multitude of seeds. And so although the pomegranate represents mortality, it also represents abundance and fruitfulness. And so you'll see pomegranates embroidered on festival cloths in Judaism for feast days. And you'll see there's a blessing, which is basically, may your blessings be as numerous as the seeds of a pomegranate. There is a school of Kabbalah thought that thinks the pomegranate was the fruit of the tree of knowledge and not an apple. So you have all these beautiful associations with the pomegranate that goes back to the mother-daughter relationship of Persephone, but it also involves and encompasses both a great abundant joy of life, and when you break it open, it literally bleeds out. So it's life and death simultaneously. It's not even like 2 sides of the same coin kind of thing, where, if it's 2 sides of the same coin, it's heads or it's tails. But with the pomegranate, it's like heads and tails at the same time, simultaneously encompassing these opposite qualities, which is why I love them so much. Artists and experiences that have influenced me. The best thing I ever did for myself the first best thing I ever did for myself was take the hardest professors I could when I was an undergrad. Really, like, really finicky, particular about craftsmanship. I had a professor who had a stamp that said redo on it, and he would submit work and he'd go in the margin and he'd stamp it, and it would just be like, redo it, redo it, redo it. So he'd assign you to do like a dozen collages, and you'd wind up doing 40 before you were done, because he would just stamp redo on the side of it. And it was amazing. It sounds crazy, but it was really amazing. Another best thing I ever did for myself in my art education was go on a study abroad. When I was a senior in my undergrad, I went and spent half a year in Finland studying at an art academy that had professors from the St. Petersburg Art Academy in St. Petersburg, Russia. And when I say academy, I mean academic, like old school, like the Renaissance, not changing. This is how Rembrandt did it. This is how Raphael did it, like really particular. And I spent 40 hours drawing a skull with a pencil. And at first the professor kept coming and saying, you need a harder pencil, you need a harder pencil. And I was looking at it and I was drawing with like a 4H. I was like, this is the hardest pencil I have. They don't make them harder than this. And he comes up and he puts a 9H pencil in my hand. And he's like, no, use this one. So I spent 40 hours drawing a skull with a 9H pencil, and my technique has never been the same since. It was just like that MFA. It's like that Instant Pot, that pressure cooker, this exercise that just accelerates your growth so much. Artists that I'm looking at right now, my big art crush right now is on Swoon. She's from New York City. She started as a street artist, and she is a printmaker, and she is just glorious. And she makes these installations that just are to die for. Swoon, S-W-O-O-N, very aptly named. Another one that I'm all about right now is Delita Martin. She goes by Black Box Press, and she does these absolutely gorgeous multidisciplinary prints. So they have woodcut, litho, collage, embroidery, all worked together, and they are just huge, powerful, inspiring images that are taking printmaking in places that it isn't traditionally understood, combining. She crosses the streams in really amazing ways. So both of these artists are working and creating work based in traditional print techniques and methods, but that goes out into areas that are not your traditional print areas. All right, so what media do I favor and why? I am a mixed media practicer. I do pretty much anything that is water-based. I don't use oil-based paints because it's hard to layer. With oil painting, you have to think about fat over lean, and so once you go to a certain point, you can't really go backwards, technically, very well. Whereas if I'm using acrylics and ink and graphite, I can just keep layering and layering and layering, and I can cut something out and collage it in, or I can take something from over here and throw it in, and then I can cut that apart and take it and put it on something else. So I have a strong background in collage, and because I like to keep that fluidity within my practice, I stick to the water-based mediums. Sometimes I'll do an oil stick over the top at the very end, but I stick to water-based mediums. I do use oil-based ink in my printmaking because it's just so much nicer to work with, but when you pull a print, there's so thin a film of ink on the paper that even though it's oil-based, I can still go over it with my water-based media, and I've never had any problems with adhesion that way. And I think it's just because you're never going to have a very thick layer of ink on your print. If you have a thick layer of ink on your print, it's not technically what you should be doing. It should be stay very, very thin. So that's why I stick to my water-based medium, but I am a printmaker predominantly. My favorites are woodcut and lithography, and I've got a couple of examples. So here is, and these are some things that, like, I don't have them in the show. So these are like sneak peeks for you. So this is a lithograph, and I made this by drawing with grease pencil on limestone, and you can see that it's got the observatory, it's got the bee, it's got the pomegranates, because I recycle my imagery and I recycle my compositions over and over and over again. And if you look at her, this one, keep your eyes on the bee and the pomegranates. Now these came, I don't even know where they came from originally at this point, but these were in a painting that is up at University Place right now. And so this print relates very strongly to that painting. But then I took the elements of this print and put them into another one. So you can see this one's got the bees in it, and it's got the pomegranates, and it introduced the sky charts, and it brings back the paper airplane. I took the elements within this litho, and it's going to be a new piece. It's actually got 2 new pieces based off of it. There's a really big woodcut that I'm working on that is 30 inches by 48 inches, so it's 4 feet wide, over 2 feet tall, and it's based in the same composition. But then I also have this one, and I thought I'd show you this one because it is the actual block that I am carving. Now you can see elements from both of those compositions. There we go. You can see elements from both of those compositions within this block. There's the sky chart, the pomegranates, worked in one of my polyhedra that's not quite carved yet. The bee is the same bee from the litho both times. Now this is an interesting piece because it actually tiles. So what happens on this side matches what happens on this side, and what happens at the top completes what happens at the bottom. So I'm actually going to, once this is done being carved, I am going to be able to tile this like wallpaper, and the pattern will repeat itself. It tessellates. This is going to be a multicolor print, and it's going to be hanging on really thin paper, and it's going to be hanging in a grid, but it's going to be suspended off the wall. So it's going to be a very tightly printed print and a very tightly carved print, printed on really delicate paper that when you hang it out from the wall kind of sways and undulates. So it's going to be this rigid grid, rigid, tight, controlled print that also has this element of chance and movement within it. And so I'm really excited about that particular print. Looking at the last question on my sheet, it says, what is your philosophy of art? For me, art is philosophy. So the philosophy of art can be really interesting to think about. When I say art is philosophy, what I mean is it's a way of thinking through the world, thinking through the human experience, asking questions, not in a way about finding an answer, but as a way of asking more questions. So the studio practice for me is a philosophic practice centered on going deeper and deeper and deeper. It's not about finding the answer. It's about the experience of asking the question and then the questions that lead out from those questions. So it's not about the thing that you wind up with at the end. This is a byproduct. This is like a record of the journey or a map of the journey, but this isn't the goal. This isn't the aim at the end. And then once I finish this, I take the elements from this and I recycle them, circle back around them, and ask the question again a little bit deeper. And you can see in my work the way stuff gets revisited and turned back under, and then you plow it back into the field as fertilizer for the next crop, and then it comes up and you plow it back under again, and it comes up and it goes back in again, and each time goes a little bit deeper. So I'm looking at this question that I have, and it says, do you believe art should be beautiful or And that's such a tricky question. That's like such a thorny question. The idea of beauty in art. I can remember when I was in grad school, one of my professors said, Adrienne, you have a beauty problem. And I was just like struck by that. It was this huge debate. There was a whole semester where we were studying the idea of beauty in art. And it's almost like in some circles, beauty is a bad word. Like it means trite or decorative or derivative. But if you look at my work, I embrace beauty. I put rhinestones so they sparkle. I use shimmering paints. I use beautiful materials. And so beauty to me is a way of drawing in the viewer, and then you see the underlying conflict within the work. And there's also a pretty violent current within my work. So it's beautiful and violent at the same time. And I feel like that beauty is a way of reaching out to the viewer and drawing them in order to have these serious conversations. I also feel like life is a beautiful thing, even though there's loss and there is trauma. And for me, it's all emotional trauma, but there's loss, there's trauma, there's really heavy stuff to think about, but it's beautiful too. Even in the situation we're in right now, with all this quarantine going on, there are moments of beauty and that you can find turned into the mix. Going back to that mythology one last time, when Pandora opened her box and let out the ills of the world, you still had hope left at the bottom of the chest. And so that beauty to me is acknowledging and celebrating that aspect. So beauty is, we could have a whole semester or two of like graduate level conversation about beauty, like big B, capital B beauty in artwork. And it's a whole field of aesthetics, and I can really like, that's a really meaty question. And I'm 37 minutes into my talk, so I think I'll leave it at that. I don't think that whether it's realistic is important. Some of my favorite work is non-representational. When I don't know if you guys remember, a few years ago, there was a Rothko show in Columbia, and my oldest daughter was 3 when it came through, so it was about 5 years ago. And I had her in her stroller, and we went to see this Rothko show. And we're walking through the gallery, and I had all of this like early work that he'd done. And then you turn the corner in the gallery, and when you turn the corner, there was one of his mature paintings, the big color fields. And so the whole time we're looking at the early work, my 3-year-old's like, babble, 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 3-year-old, babble, 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 babble. And then we turned the corner, and she went, when she saw the Rothko. And I feel like that just sums up the impact of those color field paintings. There's no imagery in it whatsoever, but the raw emotion of it, even a 3-year-old can feel when you stand in front of it. It's like standing in front of an energy field. It's so intense. To me, it's not, is it representational or not representational? Is it imagery or is it not imagery? It's what are you doing with it? What are you saying with it? What are you communicating with it? What questions are you asking with it? And are these questions that are deep enough that they don't have a surface level answer? You don't want a pat answer. You want to be able to really dive into it. So that is how I feel about the philosophy of artwork. I hope that I have interested you somewhat, and I haven't babbled on too terribly much. If you want to check out my Instagram, I put lots of images and process shots and installation shots, and you can follow what I'm doing on there. And then on my website, adriennerhodes.com, there are lots of finished final images of the work presented and put forward. So thank you for listening, and I hope you'll get a chance to go out and see the show. Stay safe and cozy, and wash your hands, and I will hopefully see you guys someday, and hopefully you'll get a chance to see the show. Thank you so much for having me, and happy art making.